friends. Sorry we're running slightly late. And our apologies to everybody who has been going to different places to come here, because we have literally been finding multiple directions. I think this has something to do with the story of sustainable development. You have to go to multiple directions to be somewhere. So this is an initiative where probably you've got a leaflet like that. Everybody, if you haven't, then my colleagues will. We are trying to look at the North-South, South-South dialogue in terms of addressing the two very complex issues. One of poverty reduction, which has now become poverty eradication. In 1992, we did not use the word eradication, we used to say alleviation. Now we have moved from there, the governments have moved to poverty eradication. So the whole theme of everything that's going around here is sustainable development in the context, or poverty eradication and green economy in the context of sustainable development, or green economy in the context of poverty eradication and sustainable development. So we are taking that big chunk and trying to see how dialogue between South-South, South-North help such a process. And how can these three very complex set of systems be addressed simultaneously? Different agencies, different groups of people, even government, virtually all organizations of government, whether they're from the north or from the south, have been trying to look at this issue and trying to be participants. I don't think there is anybody in almost any country who says that we will not address the question of poverty alleviation, if possible poverty eradication. So the interest is there, the commitment is also there. It's a question of finding a good mechanism. Some of us who have been doing this process for long enough, and many of you might know Dr. Ashok Khosla on the other side, who literally managed the 1992 civil society movement around UNCED, the Art Summit. We played a role there on question addressing poverty as a central issue. But what we ended up was having the three conventions of climate change, biodiversity, desertification, Agenda 21 as a broader question. When Agenda 21 was identified and argued and discussed, there was tremendous interest from everybody when the question was that how much money is needed to address these questions, and billions and trillions of dollars were mentioned. There was a sort of old feeling about it. However, that whole process has strengthened governments to have their ministries, their departments of environment, sustainable development as a buzzword cutting across all governments. At the same time, the civil society has taken to their heart and moved this whole agenda much further forward. It is absolutely necessity, in our opinion, that the North-South have a clear understanding, dialogue, and sort some of this complexity of issues out. They will not be resolved today or in the immediate near future. But we do need to address these, and the best way, in our opinion, is dialogues and actions. And in terms of dialogues, South-South dialogue has become much more important, was always there but wasn't articulated in this form. We have a number of panelists here, all coming from different perspectives, and these perspectives will be looking at some of the critical issues. I have requested them to look at three questions, and the questions are: what is the value and benefit of multi-stakeholder dialogue to address this complex issue of poverty eradication, green economy as important components of sustainable development? Second is, what is the role of actors, all the multi-stakeholder actors such as government, private sector, non-government organization, civil society, scientific community, even agencies, financial institutions, all of the different actors in poverty eradication and gig economy, as well as promoting sustainable development. And the third question, request to all my panelists, and then we'll hope we get input from our colleagues attending, is a set of recommendations, minimum as they are, to set up a follow-up action from this type of dialogue that we want to approach. So those would be our request to follow up if we can and focus our direction, because each of those three elements are so big that we can go in any of these directions we want. But if we can confine ourselves to these three, would be very, very useful. If I may, I can start from that end with Dr. Ashok Khosla. Dr. Ashok Khosla needs no introduction either in Rio or in these quarters, but I think his greatest story of success is my friend. So that's your, isn't that right?
My only claim to fame.
Yeah, absolutely. So besides that, Dr. Ashok Khosla is the president of IUCN now, and he is also the chair of the Club of Rome. He is the president of, chair of the board of Development Alternatives based in New Delhi, and has done some excellent pioneering work, both in the UN system in his childhood, I'll call it, and now in various manifestations that he works. If I may request Ashok to open the floor and give some of his thoughts.
Thank you, Atik. I'm personally allergic to the word dialogue simply because there's been enough talk and not enough action. So I don't want to knock the basis of this meeting, because I think dialogue is important, but that's not where I am at. So if you'll permit me, I would like to go into my own little corner and talk about what kinds of things we have to do, what kinds of actions we have to take, rather than what kinds of things we need to talk more about. This is not to say that dialogue isn't important. It's simply, that's not my area of concern. But the rest of what Atik has described is extremely important. It's fundamental. There's no issue in the world that is more urgently in need of attention than eradicating poverty. It's obscene that there should be 3 billion, or almost half the people on this planet, basically deprived of the most basic needs of all: food, water, shelter, clothing, when you have a global economy that's churning over 70 trillion a year, and which is sloshing around every day currency exchanges of the order of 1 or 2 trillion a day. So we know that the problem is eminently soluble, but there are obviously barriers to change and to solution. And I've been trying to see what are the methods to overcome those barriers. And my own organization in India has been dealing with this for about 30 years. It's one of the first social enterprises. It was set up in 1982, and we've created somewhere in the low millions of jobs, in the sense that we've caused them to be created. If we hadn't existed, they would not have been there. We don't have these people on our payroll, of course. Our technologies are used in more than 1 million, possibly more, like 2 million houses. Our empowerment projects reach something of the order, according to the British government, something of the order of 6 or 7 million households. So we're talking about the need for scale, and the models, the business models, if you like, and the technology models that you need in order to get that scale are of primary interest to me, because they are one way to get moving. But still, when you talk about 1 million or 5 million in a country which has 200 million households and maybe 800 million poor people, you're really scratching the surface. It's hardly something to write home about. So the question really is, what are the issues that we need to deal with? And here, the question of dialogue does become important. The real issues, beyond opening up new possibilities through the market and through improved technologies and so on, are the issue of financing mechanisms. You know, the rich can go and get any amount of money from the banks and from the government and from financial institutions in all our countries. The richer you are, the more you can get. But the vice versa is true too. If you want to set up a small enterprise which needs $5,000 equivalent of rupees or taka or whatever, no way you can get that. You might end up by creating 5 times as many jobs per rupee, but you won't get support. If you want to innovate, you want to set up a mechanism to develop new technologies that people can solve their own day-to-day problems with, you won't. Am I talking too long? The issue basically is one that has to be solved, that our financial mechanisms actually are geared only to making rich people richer and virtually impossible to use them for solving the problems of the poor. And the third area basically is a much more fundamental issue, and that's ownership. Ownership of various things, factors of production, land. Ownership, other than intellectual property rights, is something that needs to be solved, because if people are going to be getting out of their poverty, they have to have some assets. If they don't have any assets, it's damn difficult to become less poor. And you might get a job, but it's not going to give you very much in order to keep improving your lives. So you have this whole technology area and markets. You have this whole area of being able to access financing and knowledge and things. And then you have the whole barrier of lack of assets. So in order to change that, you've got to change your whole economics. You've got to make industries that cater to the needs of the local economy and create large numbers of jobs for very low capital, which is possible to do. My organization has been doing it for 30 years. And we create jobs for a capital investment of $2,000 to $3,000 per workplace, and they pay a reasonable living wage. I mean, they're perhaps not as much as a factory in Bombay, but then, you know, the cost of living in Bombay is much more. So if you're living in a village and you've got a decent job and a decent wage, with a capital investment involved in an enterprise of actually $3,000 for 5 jobs. In fact, it's about 40,000 rupees, $1,000 per workplace. So these are the kinds of thinking that we need. If there's need for dialogue, it's to exchange our experiences and how we solved our problems. And if we can do that a lot more, of course, that dialogue's crucial. And I'm afraid we don't actually know what we're doing in each other's countries. So I would certainly like to see more use of our newly found information technologies that make it possible for us to talk to each other, see each other, exchange information from each other. But this information has to be grounded in reality. It has to be verified, and it's verifiable. And it has to be an honest contribution to helping solve the problems of the poor. So that's basically what I was going to say. I think
what we plan to do is request each of the panelists on this side to take about 6 to 8 minutes each to make a couple of central points, and then we want to go back to the audience to get a few questions or comments, then come back on this side, use probably 2 minutes each, and round off. That is the plan. But let's see how that works out. It depends on how all this cooperation works out, how the dialogue goes. Next to me is Farah Kabir, and Farah is the country director of ActionAid Bangladesh, and she has very wide-ranging interest, but one of the areas she's working on, again, is poverty, climate change, disasters, and particularly gender dimension, and the centrality that women and men play in different ways in our lives in trying to address some of these questions, and the disproportionate burden that we have bestowed on the women in basic procurement of life's basic services, and the whole endangering of our present system through climate change and adaptation therein. So I won't say, but you have the right to choose. Over to Farah Kabir, please.
Thank you, Dr. Atiq. I got myself into this mess today because we were flying together, and when he gave me this piece of paper and we were discussing today's conversation or dialogue, it was designed in a way where I didn't see women having a part in this dialogue or gender featuring the dialogue. So I kind of hit Atiq on the head with the, what shall I say? And he said, okay, no, this has to be incorporated. And this is why, even though I agree with Dr. Khoshla that there is a fatigue of dialogue, there hasn't been enough dialogue involving women. And the concept of sustainable development that's going around, or the discussions about ending poverty that I come across, somehow still tends to not have the gender lens. There are feminist economists, there are male economists with a feminist vision. But when it comes to the actual paradigm or the implementation or discussion, I see that there is still a lot of gaps. And the gender requirement, understanding is still missing. So we talk about, there's a lot of discussion about growth and how countries are targeting 7, 8, 9% growth and so on. But it hasn't necessarily meant that it has changed the life of the poor, and especially the women. We talk, at least in my country, we have trebled the food production. Our government is going around and very proudly demonstrating that we won't need to import food because we have trebled the food production. But unfortunately, women's consumption, her nutrition level, hasn't changed. Not to the required or the kind of level that is acceptable. Similarly, women are coming into the employment sector. We're talking about development and growth and jobs, migration. The highest number of contribution to the foreign exchange, is coming either from ready-made garment sector or migrant workers. None of this has been designed with the gender lens or a dialogue or with the sensitivity that would ensure that women come out of poverty. So that's one scenario that we have, and I think this is why the dialogue has some relevance, because whatever little change that we have seen in the last 3 decades has been either because of the women's movement or sensitive academics and solidarity movements that has managed to bring about some of the changes, but we still have an uphill task. So again, on the issue of sustainable development, poverty, climate change impacts, we're still missing some of these finer points. I think the conversation that this needs to take into account how it's impacting women. The labor market, we still don't have equal wages. We have, we see investment, we see growth, but we somehow can't ensure equal wages for women. And therefore, when we're talking about trying to bring that group of people out of poverty, there remains that discrimination. Social attitudes, practices, problems have not changed. So whatever we are introducing as new measures are being introduced in an existing highly patriarchal system in most of South Asia, and perhaps there are incidents or there are examples of differences. But if I take an average view, a general view, I find that it's not happening. In terms of, if we are really looking at a sustainable development model, we really have to bring that dimension in. We have to be sensitive, and there are enough pilots and examples of innovation where women have managed to contribute. They are capable, they have the intellect to bring about the changes, they have indigenous solutions. If they have the information and the technology, they can aspire for more. But what concerns me is that when we talk about green economy and we talk about clean technology, again, we may not be taking into consideration the requirements and the impact that it has on women and children. Third, I think if we're talking about recommendations, I think that I've made the point about inclusion of women in this conversation, trying to bring in the understanding about how it impacts, and that would require a certain amount of research and innovative interventions. And lastly, creating the spaces so that the policymakers, the actors, and the movers and shakers are listening to this group. And that remains a big challenge. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Farah. Those of us who were engaged in the original Rio process, the Earth Summit, the UN Conference on Environment and Development, we know that the outcome has been much more the three conventions. That's where the focus has been. Agenda 21 has a slow inclusion into different aspects of governance or government processes, more in institutionalization and some in a lot of penetration in the civil society thinking and a lot more energy spent. One of the areas that we tried to highlight, a group called the Global Forum on Environmental Poverty, Ashok, myself, Anil Agarwal, Tariq Banouri, many others who are, some of them sadly have passed away, but others are with us. And what we did realize that poverty wasn't adequately addressed in UNCED. And the power base at that time had told us that, sorry, two issues we could not address. One was poverty, the other was demilitarization. And demilitarization is still not in the agenda. Poverty has entered the agenda. And at that time we were very concerned about poverty and ecosystem, but poverty was central, and we were definitely given the assurance it will take about 10 years for poverty to be somewhere in the global planning central focus. That brought the whole question of Millennium Development Goal, in which number one indicator or target is poverty reduction, half of the worst form of poverty, which we then criticize, saying, which means that you are committing the other half to uncertain eternity. We don't know where that will come from. That debate has been going on. On the other hand, poverty and ecosystem has become very integral. And ecosystem services, ecosystem management. My friend Paul here runs the global initiative on research on poverty and ecosystem services, poverty eradication, poverty alleviation, ecosystem services, ESPA, which is a organization for research mostly across, and if I may request Paul to address the issues in the time that we have.
Okay, thanks, Atik. What I want to do is to, if I can get the mouse to work, illustrate this. And as Atik said, I am the director of ESPA, which is a UK-funded research program. And I want to pick up a couple of the points. One of the points was about grounding in reality. And I had a real grounding in reality over the last month and a half. ESPA is a global program, and we've got about 25 projects running at the moment. In the lead up to Rio, I travelled to meet quite a few of them. And I just want to share the experiences, because there's a lot of things which I can bring in terms of the voices of communities around the world who are trying to make this really difficult link. We know a lot about ecosystem services. We know about poverty alleviation. The reason that the word "for" is italicized, the really difficult thing is, how do you actually make the link that the environment works for people? how do you make that link so that ecosystem services, environmental services, are contributing to the alleviation of poverty of all people around the world? And what I'll do is just take you to a number of sites which are working, and this is a site in Bolivia where the water is running out. And the reason for that is that the ecosystems have been completely denuded. The forests have gone, and we have there a project which is trying to get communities to re-engage. So I'm going to go through and illustrate how different actors have got really critical roles to play in getting this grounding of how we get ecosystems to contribute to poverty. So here in Bolivia, the community-based organisations are critical in terms of giving people like this family a voice in how the ecosystems contribute to their lives. We have another project which is just starting in Colombia. This is a project which brings together gender and innovation. This is Fabia. She's a local farmer. She's a real innovator, a leading force in her community. But she couldn't work alone. She needed help from multilaterals, in this case Global Environment Fund, and an NGO to release one of the world's first payments for ecosystem services. This was 10 years ago, and when I was there, she was telling me how this combination of her community working with a multilateral and NGOs completely changed their lives. You can go onto our website and hear a story in her own voice. This is the most amazing location I've been. It is an example where ecosystem services have contributed to poverty alleviation and are really improving lives. Now, conversely, unfortunately, immediately after that, I went and saw exactly the opposite. With Bekas and Dijan took me out to the Sundarbans and to an island which was absolutely devastated by Cyclone Isla just over exactly 3 years ago. And in the 3 years since then, this community has not been able to grow food, has not had clean water, has been completely dependent on handouts and the occasional fish that they can catch from the river. The ecosystem was in a very poor state, so that meant they had no resilience. And the question I was asked there is, help. What do we do next? And that comes back to that last of those three questions, is how do we actually make recommendations about what's going on? One of the things which I really took home from my visit there is the role of research in this case. And what I saw in the Sundarbans and travelling there was that we had ignored that there are environmental limits. If you go beyond those limits, the environment comes back and haunts you. There, people were vulnerable because we didn't use the information that we had about sustainability. And to move back is much more difficult, as I'll illustrate at the end of my talk. Then Zambia. And I went to Zambia to look at one of our projects, which was looking at land use change. Across all of Africa, this is a really critical issue. So going out of Lusaka, heading east towards Malawi, Mozambique, we went through a range of landscapes, and I was being taken to a valley which is used to illustrate the link between people. Now, when we went there, I was told we're going to go down a 100-kilometre transect, going from agricultural areas down through game management area and then into a national park. And the researcher who was there said, this is an amazing transect. 5 years ago, he spent all his time doing his PhD. We had a shock. In those 5 years, everything had changed. Agriculture had gone the entire length. Cotton had come in because of the private sector. The private sector had a policy to bring in cotton, but conflicting with that was a government policy to bring in maize, and those policies were at odds. Livestock was coming in, that was playing with disease, it was interfering with the wildlife, but most importantly, people and communities, their lives were changing, and in many cases, not for the better. And one of the things which I took from there was that you've got all of these different policies, all of these different actors going in separate directions, and when we work apart, we never succeed. And that was brought home the last place I went, which was to Wild Coast in the Eastern Cape. A very interesting place. We used to know this as Transkei, one of the main homeland areas. Now, very high population density here, and the ecosystems, again, have been highly degraded, leading to very low productivity, huge problems with invasive species, and the people on this landscape, again, only survive because of social handouts. They no longer have a livelihood apart from handouts, and that's not what they want. So again, this is an example of getting it wrong. So my question is, how do we get it right? Because there are so many examples of we know, well, if we do it this way, we're getting it wrong. But as Atik has asked, what do we need to do to make sure that we get sustainable development and poverty alleviation working together? And it was at the end, when we were talking about this, that my South African hosts said, well, actually, we've got to be starting to think about new ways of working, so that you've got, in their case, they were talking about the role of social enterprises, we've also heard about, because people do not want handouts. They want to actually improve their own lives. But this horrible mess of conflicting policies and institutional objectives is what actually, instead of helping them to improve their lives, actually acts as the barrier. So thinking about that. And my last slide has got a couple points. Firstly, all of these sites, we talked a lot about policy, and everybody told me policy alone is not enough. We can spend all our time getting effective policies, but if the policies aren't used or if they conflict, we're never going to make progress. So we've got to have effective institutions. We've got to have effective structures, bringing together this range of different actors I mentioned, community-based organisations, NGOs, research, government, private sector, multilateral, social enterprises. But the second point is working in isolation is completely counterproductive. And my third and final point is, in terms of action point, is it has to go beyond dialogue to action. And one of the things which I think is really important in terms of action is to creatively bring these groups together and get them to work to a common and shared objective. And that is where getting groups to actually coordinate that, whether it is a social enterprise or some form of coordinating institution, becomes really important. Because if you get one of those groups doing it, they will deliver against their own agenda. So my 3 points are: policy is not enough, working in isolation is counterproductive. Let's find some more productive ways of working together.
Thank you, Paul. We've heard the ecosystems, the limits to some of the ecosystemic challenges and nature's limit, as it were, in some cases. Climate change has been one of the greatest threats that human society has faced, and huge amount of human endeavor, research, negotiations, activities, ordinary communities, community-based societies, communities have been responding to these in their own ways, some of the disasters that we have heard. But it really is not a very hopeful story at this point in time. We don't know whether we have solutions ahead where all the governments have agreed that we need to save this planet in a way. Individually, they all say yes, yes, yes. But collectively, it hasn't happened. It hasn't happened in Copenhagen, and the follow-up to Kyoto is a shambles. And many of the scientists across, not necessarily used to be on the edges of the border of scientific activities, now they're becoming more central and looking at the whole issues of geoengineering, bioengineering as approaches, as alternatives. When this system may not have delivered, we might have to have much more aggressive technologies. Now, are they going to be social friendly, ecosystem friendly? Are they going to work properly for our societies? Many of these issues have been addressed, and the whole ethics around these becomes quite challenging. And the scientists in Royal Society in UK pulling together the northern-southern groups have been working at it. I have been engaged with them in quite a bit of understanding. And this whole questions of taking such initiatives. Andy Parker has been working on this project, and also Royal Society has been more recently very, very engaged in the issues of population. And population questions, are there limits? Should there be limits? And ethics of that is become very, very complex. But I would request Andy to take his perspective and hopefully try to touch the 3 points that we suggested. Over to Andy Parker.
I will do my best. So thank you, Atik. I work for the Royal Society. My name's Andy Parker, and I'm a senior policy advisor there in the Science Policy Centre, where we seek to influence policy making in the UK and around the world with the best science policy advice. I'm here to talk briefly about a multi-stakeholder dialogue that's already underway. This is a cooperative NGO initiative. It's one that brought the Royal Society and BCAS into partnership. And as Atik mentioned, it's on the governance of solar geoengineering, sometimes known as solar radiation management, or SRM. Some of you might already be familiar with what is a rather scary idea, the idea of solar geoengineering. It does crop up in the newspapers from time to time. And it's the concept of deliberately intervening in the planet's climate in order to counter global warming. At the beginning of the session, Ashok mentioned that in general there's possibly too much talk and not enough action in the real world. I'd suggest that perhaps I work on the one area, the exception that proves the rule. I'm quite happy to see talk on solar geoengineering for now, perhaps to save action for a later date, if it's ever considered prudent. So I'll take a few moments to characterise the problem and then describe how this dialogue that's already underway is seeking to address it. The area of geoengineering is quite different to those that we've talked about already. It's perhaps the ultimate in centralised decision-making for environmental management. We're talking about taking control of the entire planet's climate. So I wonder, a quick show of hands, I'd personally just interested. Who here would say that they're already familiar with the concept of SRM, or solar geoengineering? We have we probably less than half a dozen. I think I'd probably find that to be quite reassuring. It's certainly a concept that only a fool would be joyful or excited about. But it emerged with people, with scientists who looked at the increasing rate of greenhouse gas emissions, who looked at the slow pace of negotiations at the UNFCCC and started wondering, what do we do if we can't get these carbon emissions under control? What do we do if the climate proves more sensitive to greenhouse gases than we currently fear? And solar geoengineering was suggested. For those not familiar, it is possible to cool the Earth by reflecting away a small percentage of inbound sunlight. When a large volcano erupts, it blasts millions of tons of sulfur dioxide up into the stratosphere, and this reflects away a small percentage of sunlight. And some scientists have suggested that it's something that we might want to imitate deliberately in order to cool the planet. This would be cheap, scarily cheap, I think it's been fairly described as, and we know that it is the only way of cooling the Earth at short order. We're talking years to decades. So if humanity did decide that it wanted to cool the Earth quickly, for whatever reason, then SRM represents the only way of achieving it. I don't think I need to tell an audience as knowledgeable as this one that that's not the only story. Of course, the concerns with SRM are legitimate. They're very serious, and they relate to the side effects and to the implications of the technology as a whole. So the physical side effects, I'm sure you can imagine this would be intervening with a tremendously complicated system. There would be unknown effects, things like what would happen to levels of ozone in the stratosphere. There'd be unknown effects, so things that you couldn't know would happen until you actually start to deploy this. Those are the scientific, physical implications. To my mind, the tougher stuff are the human dimensions, not the scientific ones. So who owns this technology? Who gets to research it? Who controls it? How can we make sure that if and when research does go ahead, that it's conducted safely, responsibly, and in a cooperative manner? So if you can imagine a scenario, let's imagine that my country, the UK, decided to deploy the technology. I want to emphasise this is not something I'm expecting to happen. This is a thought experiment. But it deployed the technology. Then another country experienced an extreme weather event, a failure of the monsoon, a huge storm. Might that country attribute the failure of the monsoon to the solar radiation management deployment? I think you can bet that some people would think it was. Think the two things were linked. A lot of scientists would say it was. A lot of scientists would probably say it wasn't. But what would the country do? Would there be sanctions against the UK? Would there be military action? Let's think further. Even if there were no side effects with taking control of the planet's climate and cooling the temperature artificially, that still doesn't present, that's an unrealistic scenario, but it still doesn't solve any problems. You can imagine that, for example, Russia might want the global thermostat to be set 2 or 3 degrees warmer than, say, India would. All of this put together creates a really ugly, complicated mess of differing worldviews, of ethics, about our relationship with nature, issues of procedural justice. And there's going to be no one-size-fits-all solution to this when it comes to governance. There's no neat solution that everyone will be pleased with. And therein lies the problem. So I've described it. I'm sure you're wondering now, what are we doing about it? And how does this relate to sustainable development and North-South dialogues? Well, my employer, the Royal Society, along with TWAS, which is the Academy of Sciences for the Developing World, and EDF, Environmental Defence Fund, that's the green NGO from the United States, launched the SRM Governance initiative 2 years ago. And Atiq was on the steering group who helped set this up and set its direction. And this is an initiative looking at how this technology could be governed. We've got no set destination, and we're not trying to seek consensus from all the different partners who are taking place. We're not seeking to make policy recommendations. So, in essence, we've set up a talking shop, a platform for dialogue between the different partners, different stakeholders who might have views on this topic. We've assembled a stellar working group, 27 members, expertise in a range of subjects from all around the world, north, south. And we've got a large range of stakeholder partners. That's NGOs who are interested in taking part, not because they support SRM, not because they even support SRMGI, but just because they want to have their voice heard as part of this project. Run through a few of them quickly: BCAS, Globe International, the Red Cross, Red Crescent Climate Centre, the Chinese Academy of Sciences, Climate Network Africa, Greenpeace. There are an awful lot out there who are interested in having their voices heard. And we're actively trying to bring in more and more people and organisations from those representing the most vulnerable people in the world. So those are the people who are most vulnerable to climate change and so have most to gain from the prudent development of SRM, but also the most to lose if it was developed inappropriately and deployed in an unsafe manner. There's more to this than just creating a talking shop. There's a subtext here. We've published a report. Again, no policy recommendations. It just tries to stake out the different perspectives on how this could be governed, who should do it, which organisations. Perhaps the most important part of our work is creating this platform for dialogue. The subtext of trying to create a culture of international collaboration, cooperation, on how this technology will develop. We don't know whether it will be useful or harmful. It has the potential to be extremely useful or extremely harmful. If anyone tells you that they know it will be good or bad, then be very suspicious. We just don't have the information at this stage. So we don't know what the future holds. There is the potential for unilateralism and for mistrust, and that we think by holding this dialogue, by creating a culture of cooperation, we're setting up hopefully the conditions for this to be dealt with prudently as we learn more about the technology. I will turn things over to you. I'm interested to hear your perspectives on whether this is something that's useful, what direction it should go in, how we can get more perspectives involved in our work. We've had meetings in Pakistan, India, China. We've got a meeting in Senegal in 2 weeks' time, and Atiq and I have talked about holding a meeting in Bangladesh possibly in 2013. So I hope in the presentation I've given some indication of my views on the value of multi-stakeholder dialogues. This is not specifically for green economy, for poverty eradication. That said, by addressing the fundamental issue of climate change, this cross-cuts all of those different sectors. Same goes for the role of different actors. We are very interested in having all voices involved in this, so policymakers, NGOs, civil society representatives, and of course people like the scientists who make up the Fellows of the Royal Society. In terms of set of recommendations for follow-up actions, we intend to keep going with our work. If you represent an NGO who you'd be interested in taking part, there are no particular responsibilities if you do want to take part. We'd just be interested in having your opinions and having you at our meetings and so on. Please come and get involved, and I would welcome your feedback as well, your recommendations for what we